Today I'm going to talk about the 1920s, which of course I'll mostly talk about a lot of the culture. I'll probably talk about a few political elections that were kind of well known also in the 20s. So we'll get to that too. Let me go ahead and of course talk about, because last time we had been discussing previously, I think we had done World War I. We kind of wrapped up that. And I started getting into the 1920s, all the unrest that occurred kind of around 1920, when you had all the different strikes they had in the United States. And I think I told you that the Roaring Twenties really didn't get started until really the 1923-29. So it's really the peak of the Roaring Twenties is, of course, primarily from 1923 to 29, mostly under Calvin Coolidge's administration is where most, of course, that happens more or less. So, of course, one of the big things we're going to talk about today, as you know, is the United States ban alcohol, which is something that's, pretty amazing. Those people didn't think that even happened before. But it was all because of the 18th Amendment that this, of course, occurred. This was kind of seen as like a social experiment that was really brought on by two things. It was brought on by, of course, World War I, because of the fact that you had a lot of Americans fighting in the war. Also, we were trying to supply a lot of grain to the Allies in Europe. So we didn't really want to use all our grain to, make, I guess, alcohol out of it. And then, of course, we talked about the temperance movement. That was, of course, the other thing that, of course, caused it. You had women like Carrie Nation, they mentioned in the video, or Billy Sunday. I think you may have heard of him. He was a famous preacher in the 1920s. He basically pushed everybody to want to, ban alcohol. And so they ratified, I believe, the 18th Amendment in 1919. It was passed in 1920 is when it eventually it basically, became official law. So basically, it's amazing about this, but they banned things like, like basic, beer, like Shiner Bock here. I've got here, of course, typical, probably 5 to 6% alcohol, something like that. Banned whiskey, banned any kind of wine, except for religious reasons, of course, obviously, was also banned also as well. They did call it a nickname, if you know about this. They called the so-called Prohibition Era, they called it the Noble Experiment from 1920 to 1933. And you can see there the 18th Amendment, it basically prohibited it from being made, like the alcohol being made, for it being sold, and also for it to be transported. So you can't move it around or anything like that. What's really weird about the 18th Amendment, it didn't say anything about drinking it. So it actually didn't ban drinking, even though, of course, the 18th Amendment's out there, but there's no thing about that. But eventually what happened was they would create this act, if you know about this, later in 1919 also as well to go along with it, which was called the so-called Prohibition Enforcement Act, also called the Volstead Act, which was named after Andrew Volstead, who was a representative in Congress from Minnesota. And that's the actual act that would enforce prohibition, in the United States for the next 12, 13 years, and also defined what alcohol was. So anything that was 0.5% of alcohol in some kind of beverage or more was considered alcohol. So, I guess there was stipulations where, for sacramental purposes, or I think it maybe in Judaism, they used it or whatever, maybe for like medical purposes as well, like medicine or something like that. There was ways to get it. I know my grandfather was a pharmacist, during that time, and I imagine he could get alcohol pretty easily because he was a pharmacist, that kind of thing. But you know much about the Prohibition Era, it divided people into what they call wets and what they call dries. Wets were people that basically criticized it and they wanted to bring alcohol back, make it legal. And then people that were dries were people that were against it, that were in favor. They were in favor of, prohibition, of making alcohol illegal. And so that's why today, if you go to certain parts of the United States, they still have what they call dry counties, that kind of deal, which was kind of still remnants from that time period. Or also a lot of regulations on alcohol in some states where they'll have like an ABC store where you got to buy it specifically in a certain store. You can't just buy it at the grocery store. So all that's kind of a remnants of prohibition, a long time ago. But there was still, of course, an increased demand for it. In fact, they think that prohibition actually made things worse with people drinking alcohol. And of course, it also led to, as you know, crime, with, of course, the mafia being developed and illegal alcohol being, of course, made or obviously being imported. There was actually what they call a speakeasy. I think I've got a few slides on this if you want to look at them later. Yeah, those are different groups that were kind of involved. A lot of religious groups, were for and against. Like the Catholics, wanted to keep it. The Jews wanted to keep it because they, that's part of their religion. But the Protestants were like, no, they were the opposite, of course. So you got the reformers there, of course. Obviously, consumption of alcohol, they wanted to get that down, not people have us, drunk. But you can see on the negative side of it, it led to lawlessness, organized crime, new kinds of criminals, of course, making money off of course, illegal alcohol. They did have what they call speakeasies, which you may have heard about, the speakeasies. Speakeasies were these secret bars, basically that sprouted out all over the place, mostly in cities. So it's like a secret place where you could go get alcohol. And a lot of times they would basically, to get in, you would have to know some kind of password or something like that to get in. It would be like a hole in the door, and the guy would open, he would say, "Speakeasy," and you have to basically tell him what the password is to get in. If you were like the lower classes and you couldn't get into like a fancier speakeasy or whatever, they had these lower end dives that were called like a blind tiger or a blind pig. That was a type of place where, like a speakeasy, where they would show like some kind of animal that was kind of weird, like a blind tiger or something like that, blind pig. And you would basically pay the money to see the pig, and then they'd give you some alcohol for free. Also, people would have moonshine. That's where the moonshine thing got started. People started making that. People would make bathtub gin also as well. They had this other stuff called Jamaica ginger extract. They called it Jake for short. It was some kind of synthetic stuff that was awful. And if you drank it, it would basically paralyze your limbs. It was terrible. People would give it, they call it Jake leg or something like that, which you didn't want to drink that. But a lot of people, I guess, drank that because they couldn't find anything else to actually drink, alcohol-wise or whatever. Like we said, that one big thing that happened, of course, which is very famous, about prohibition, of course, is, you have the rise in, of course, organized crime. The mafia, got started, of course, because of, prohibition. Like New York, Chicago, those were your places where a lot of your organized crime got started. Organized crime like in prostitution, gambling, also racketeering, things like that. They were also notorious for as well. But Al Capone, known as Scarface, you of course see there, was of course one of the most notorious that was involved in developing really prohibition in Chicago. Selling illegal alcohol, etc. And so the term rum runner, bootlegger, becomes synonymous with Al Capone and all that. They would even import alcohol from like Canada, basically, like the Seagram's brand, I think was the popular one they imported, if you know about that. And they say he made millions. I forget the amount of money he made, but it was in the millions that he made, of course, with this illegal empire of alcohol. And he got to the point where he practically controlled the city so bad that basically he started eliminating all the competition. They could talk about Bugs Malone, which was an Irish gang. He started killing off all the Irish gangsters, basically. And so it got to the point where most of the mafia was predominantly Italian or Sicilian that controlled it, except maybe some of the Jews that were there later. And part of why Capone got taken down, if you know about it, remember that joke the guy said about him paying his taxes? Remember at the end of that little short video? That's why Capone got taken down, because he didn't pay his federal taxes. And so this guy named Elliot Ness, who was with the U.S. Treasury, eventually brought him down. You may have seen that TV show or movie called The Untouchables. I think it's a famous Sean Connery movie with, who's it got in there? The famous actor, Kevin Costner's in it too. Anyway, he helped bring him down in 1932. And Capone's the one that was famous later for living. He was at Alcatraz, I think, was one of the prisons he was, I think, in at the end of his life and all that. So that's Capone and all of that. But yeah, Prohibition would go on until 1933. It eventually ends due to FDR, who came in. He was more pro-wet. And so that's basically what got rid of it. And they eventually would replace it, the 18th Amendment, with the 21st Amendment, which would basically repeal it. That's what you have to do to get rid of it. You have to repeal the other with another one. And so that's basically how they, ended that experiment. So I think after that, after Prohibition ended, people didn't drink as much. It's really weird about that. But it seems like when something's illegal, people want it more. Like with illegal drugs today, it seems like if it was more legal, I think people probably wouldn't care for it as much, So, but anyway, so that's basically the period and that's kind of part of the whole, Roaring Twenties, the flappers, and the jazz era, and all that kind of went along. Yeah, like the Cotton Club and all these fancy clubs where they sold alcohol, but it was kind of illegal, that kind of deal. All right, I'm going to move on next. I want to, of course, talk about, here's, of course, results of it right here. So, yeah, 21st Amendment, of course, would repeal it. But I want to, of course, get into next and talk about the Harding administration, of course, in the early 20s. If you know about the Harding administration, they were one of the most scandalous in American history. In fact, they say Harding, Warren G. Harding, is considered one of the worst presidents in American history. He's definitely in the top 10 worst overall, they believe. And, of course, it's because of the fact that they had all these different scandals that happened under his administration that happened. I think it came out mostly in 1923. In 1924. So it ends up being one of the most corrupt, I think, up there with Ulysses S. Grant that we've talked about before. And there were several scandals that were very famous that was under him. The one that they always talk about the most that was very famous was the one that was called the Teapot Dome scandal, which involved Albert B. Fall, who was his Secretary of the Interior. And apparently what Fall was doing was he was taking federal land where they had like oil there, and he was selling drilling leases to oil companies so they could go on there and basically do it. And he took like something like $385,000 worth of bribes from various oil companies, which he put in his pocket basically. And what happened was the Senate discovered this, and he was investigated in August of 1923, and he got put on trial for it, and he was convicted. Yeah. He was actually sentenced to prison. And what you can see there, he was one of the first cabinet officers in American history to actually go to prison for doing something illegal while in office. I think before they'd kind of gotten off. In this case, they did not. And he only served 1 year in prison, apparently. Albert B. Fall. I always thought that name's kind of an ironic name, I think they also had some oil areas too, like in California. There's one called Elk Hills, I think it is, in Central California. He also sold some there too, made money as well. I was also showing the so-called Ohio gang that they also talk about as well. The Ohio gang was like a ring of these corrupt politicians and industrial leaders. They were mostly from Ohio, and they were in Harding's administration. They made a lot of money illegally, I guess, under him. And a lot of these scandals later came out in 1923 and 1924. You can see right there, there's one named, his attorney general, which is Harry Daugherty, of course, right there, was an example of one who was basically making money illegally. And he was actually, I think, taking money from like bootleggers and people in the Prohibition. Basically gave him money to basically look the other way. And so he was kind of helping people to violate the so-called Volstead Act that I talked about. So he was one example right there. There was also this other guy we need to mention. Trying to think about how they have him right there. There's another guy I did want to mention. I think there he is right there. Charles Forbes. He was also famous too under Harding. Forbes was the head of what they now call the VA, the Veterans Administration. And he actually stole a lot of money. They're not sure exactly how much it was, but apparently there was like something like $200 million that was missing. It was part of the veteran. They call it the Veterans Bureau at the time. Now they call it VA or Veterans Administration. But he was later fired for that too. I'm not sure if he went to prison or not, but he got in trouble for that too as well. So it's kind of examples of some of these people that were kind of around Harding that was there. Here's another one with the so-called Teapot Dome. They call it Teapot Dome because it's structure that's in Wyoming, where it was located on public land. And it has like a teapot shape to it, and so hence the name. I don't know if that's right, 400,000. So yeah, almost 400,000. That's about right, about how much it was. Somewhere in that range. That's how much it was he stole from through bribery, I guess. But now, of course, if you know about the whole scandals, a lot of them did not become public until 1923, 1924. And most of them happened, by the way, after Warren G. Harding had died. Because if you know about Harding, he's one of the presidents that died in office that you have. Second to last one, I guess the other one after that. Actually, they have two more after that. I think FDR dies, and then JFK, I guess, dies in office. But he would later die of a heart attack. Yeah, Warren G. Harding. And apparently he went on this trip where he went to Alaska, and on the way back, he started getting ill. And anyway, his Surgeon General, the doctor, his main doctor, thought he had food poisoning. Now, he didn't think it was like a heart attack or anything like that. And by the time they got to San Francisco, it was too late. And he died of a heart attack on August 2nd, 1923. So he was like the 29th president. And so what happened was you have this other man that comes in that replaces him, which is Calvin Coolidge. You see there. And Calvin Coolidge had been the governor of Massachusetts. I think I talked about him. He's one that had helped put down the Boston police strike. If you remember correctly, I talked about that before. And he had become vice president when Harding ran in 1920. And anyway, he would serve as president from 1923 to 1929 as the 30th president of the United States. I'll get to it later, but he had a nickname. They called him Silent Cal. I'll explain that later, why it's dubbed that, but we'll get more into what that was. By the way, about Harding, that wasn't it about him. Even though he was dead, there was a bunch of these rumors that ran around about Harding that he had a bunch of affairs with women while he was in the White House. There was one where I think he slept with his secretary, Nan Britton. That's a true story. And then they think he had this other woman he had, Carrie Fulton Phillips. I think when he was running for president in 1920, she actually blackmailed him and said if she didn't give her some money, that he'd basically tell everybody about the affair and all that. And so there was also this rumor, which they now proved to be, they don't think it's true now, but there was a lot of people thought that after this happened and all that, that apparently they thought his wife, his first lady, Florence Harding, had poisoned him. That's the reason why he really died, because they thought the doctor thought it was food poisoning, right? Of course. But they don't think it's true about that. And so, yeah, Coolidge would come in, like I'm saying. Coolidge, of course, he would be the president, that would be really when the Roaring Twenties really takes off. And of course, it has, becomes a very prosperous period, of course, overall. So that's the next thing I did want to talk about. I want to talk about, more about Calvin Coolidge here, who I said comes in as president in 1923. You can see he was from Vermont originally. And you can see he was kind of like the same thing of Harding. He had kind of the same ideas: isolationist foreign policy, favored tax cuts, limited aid for farmers, things like that. I guess were things that he kind of favored more or less. But the big thing that he believed in the most, like most Republicans, was that the fact that he believed in like a laissez-faire kind of economics. That was the policy that a lot occurred in the 1920s. Of course, some people think it caused the Great Depression later, these beliefs. And like Harding, he thought the same thing, that there ought to be less government regulations in business. I think we've talked about this multiple times before. He had a famous quote he was known for. I think I mentioned one before. He mentioned, I think, about the Boston police strike, but he said something like, the chief business of the American people is business. And so he's talking about the economy and capitalism and things like that. That's basically, what he thought that America's for mostly, and why it's a great country and all that. And of course, they called him Silent Cal. The reason why they called him that was because he didn't speak much. He would say little, very little he would say, actually, like social settings or whatever. There was a joke actually they told once, which is kind of famous. He was at a party. This woman told him, said, "I bet I could get you to say more than 3 words." And the whole dinner party or whatever it was, he wouldn't say anything. And then before they left or whatever, he turned to the woman and he said, "You lose." So anyway, so he didn't say much, Silent Cal. But Coolidge would run against, by the way, John W. Davis, who was from West Virginia. He was like a politician, ambassador, and I think a lawyer. I think he worked in the Justice Department at one point under Woodrow Wilson. He ran, and then also they had Robert La Follette ran too, also in the 1924 election for what was like a brief party called the Progressive Party, which I guess was a kind of a similar to the one that Teddy Roosevelt had before. But the Progressive Party was more left wing. It was like composed of labor people, farmers, and also socialists that were in it. And they only won one state, which was Wisconsin, during the actual election. The Democrats, by the way, tried to accuse Coolidge and the Republicans of somehow being involved with the Harding scandals and the corruption and all that. But it didn't seem to affect Coolidge much because he seemed to be kind of connected more to the prosperity that was starting to take off in the 1920s and the Roaring Twenties. And so Coolidge also had a great campaign slogan. That was one thing that was real famous about it, which was "Keep cool with Coolidge." And so that slogan really helped Coolidge, eventually win the election. And he won it, by the way, in a landslide, 382 electoral votes, of course, which was pretty good. And so prosperity, pretty much was, like I said, would go on for several years after, of course, Coolidge comes in. So most of the Roaring Twenties, like the prosperity of it anyway, predominantly occurs under Coolidge's administration. Right, now I'm going to get in today, and I'm going to talk about more into like the culture of the Roaring Twenties, which, is something that's well known. That's big, of course. You can see the flappers there at the top, of course, which are very famous, more or less. So yeah, we'll get into the culture. It's really the thing that dominates it the most, and people talk about that the most, probably more than anything else that happened politically, economically, etc. Why was the Roaring Twenties prosperous? Well, a lot of it had to do with the fact that, between the 19th and the 20th centuries, you start seeing this shift where the country's becoming more modernized. So you got this deal where you got all these new technologies that are starting to be created, sold to people. So all kinds of new kinds of goods, cars, radios, you can see airplanes, all kinds of new kinds of gadgets that are coming out that make life more easier. Phonograph or whatever it is that's being mass produced. And so that had a lot to do with, mass consumerism kind of takes off, in the country You can see, yeah, automobile becomes popular, movies become popular, jazz becomes popular. Those kind of things take off. Radios like TV back in those days. New kinds of sporting events become popular, baseball, football, etc. Let me talk about, of course, some examples of things that were kind of famous, of course, in the Roaring Twenties. Of course, you got the Model T that they had first. I'll talk about that, and then we'll talk about the Model A also as well. But yeah, they got the Model T. That's one thing, of course, that was real famous. The first mass-produced automobile came out. And I think I talked about this before. Henry Ford Motor Company, of course, started producing it in 1909. And it's considered one of the first mass-produced cars. I think in the first year, I think he produced like 11,000 cars initially. And then by the 1920s, he was producing over 1 million a year. Yeah, he was. This is crazy. In 1909 to 1927, they built 27 million Model Ts. That's a lot. And they called it the Tin Lizzie because it was almost like a tin can on wheels. But it was actually pretty cheap. You could actually get one, I think, for like something like $950, something under $100,000, basically. And automobiles were pretty important, like in American history. If you know about it, it helped to revolutionize American society, like everywhere. As long as they had roads, basically, it enabled people to go anywhere. It's like not like you had to be on a timetable where you had to get on a plane or get on a train. As long as they had roads, you could drive somewhere. Horses, took longer to get somewhere and things like that. Henry Ford would also build the Model A, Ford Model A. And the Model A, if you know about it, was the first automobile to have a V8 engine. I remember hearing the story about John Dillinger writing a famous letter to Henry Ford, congratulating and saying thank you for building such a great car. It enabled me to get away from the cops. So anyway, yeah, so the automobile was something that was really important. Also women, it gave women a lot of more independence. Like women could, go anywhere, I guess, too, if they've got an automobile. I always talk about the fact that the automobile was one of like probably 3 things that gave women more rights in this country, made them more equal, which was like, voting was one of like, suffrage, right to vote, the automobile, and also birth control. I think they have the diaphragm kind of comes out around right before that. So those kind of things give women more independence in general. And of course, because of it, you got the rise of the flappers. That's another thing, of course, that happened that's real famous, about the Roaring Twenties is the flappers that come about, in the 1920s. These women that are more wild, and, more independent. And they wear bobbed hairs. They wear these helmet hats, I think they would sometimes wear. Listen to jazz music, smoke, they drank, they were promiscuous, things like that. And so, yeah, of course, they're involved in the dance craze. I'll get to that later. Like they have the Charleston, the foxtrot, those kind of dances, of course, become real big in the Roaring Twenties. Yeah, the flappers were big icons, in the Roaring Twenties. And of course, I was showing you the flappers up here, I guess it was. Where was it? Right here, So yeah, it's typical of the Roaring Twenties, basically at that time. Short hair, things like that. Right. I also want to get into, and I want to talk about also this other famous man you may have heard of course, who was, of course, Charles Lindbergh. I don't know if you know much about Lindbergh, but Lindbergh was one of the most famous men of the 1920s. He was big. Yeah, everybody knew who he was. He was like a household name, more or less. Lindbergh was very famous. He was the one that was the first to cross the Atlantic by himself in a plane. So a transatlantic flight in 1927. And of course, he was known as Lucky Lindy. And he, of course, had his famous plane there, he, of course, may have heard of, which is the Spirit of St. Louis, which he helped design and build. And, of course, it made him famous, of course, worldwide. I do have a little short video that I will show, of course, quickly, of course, on Lindbergh.
Charles Lindbergh was born in Detroit, Michigan in 1902. From an early age, Charles had a knack for mechanical things. He learned to drive the family car at age 11. Soon after, he became interested in airplanes. Charles began working for the U.S. Postal Service, delivering mail by airplane. He flew the mail route from St. Louis to Chicago. Soon, Charles heard about a contest offering a prize of $25,000 for the first non-stop flight from New York to Paris. He was excited to enter. A few St. Louis businessmen donated money to build Charles a special plane that could go the far distance. He named the plane the Spirit of St. Louis. On May 20th, 1927, he flew from Long Island, New York to Paris, France. The 3,600-mile trip took him 33 hours and 30 minutes. At only 25 years old, he became famous for being the first person to cross the Atlantic Ocean by airplane. Besides the award money, he was also awarded the nation's highest military decoration, the Medal of Honor. After his Atlantic flight, Lindbergh used his fame to promote the development of both commercial aviation and air mail services in the United States and the Americas. He married Anne Moreau in 1929, and they had 6 children. On March 1st, 1932, Charles' infant son was kidnapped from their home. Investigators searched for the baby, but sadly, he was found dead. Charles and Anne were devastated. The Lindberghs were exhausted from the media and public attention following their son's death. To escape the constant attention, they secretly moved to Europe to live in peace. They returned to the United States in 1939. Charles went on to serve in World War I and II and worked on advances in aviation. He passed away in Maui, Hawaii on August 26, 1974.
Short little video, of course, on Charles Lindbergh. Of course, he was controversial, if you know about this, because he kind of supported the Nazis. He was kind of, I think, Hitler gave him some kind of medal, if you know about that, when he went over there, because the Nazis were kind of interested in developing the Luftwaffe. You know about that. But anyway, he flew that flight from New York to Paris. I think he started from Long Island, which they said took like 30-something hours from actually cross. May 20 to 21st, and of course, it became a sensation. If you know about that, people went crazy, over the airplane. And so the next thing you know, commercial airplanes took off more after that. Different countries wanted to create better air forces and things like that. And so that's why Lindbergh was such a popular person, in the 1920s, more or less. I did want to talk about, of course, athletics, like sports, of course, which was going on at the time. Of course, as you know, the most popular sport in America was baseball, which took off. Yeah, that was the biggest sport everybody wanted, America's pastime, as they sometimes called it. And, of course, the big stars in those days were Babe Ruth, played for the New York Yankees, and Ty Cobb, who played for the Detroit Tigers. Those are your biggest stars. I think Ty Cobb was called the Georgia Peach. And so if you know about Babe Ruth, he was famous for, in the 1920s, hitting 60 home runs one year, which was not broken, by the way, until 1974 by Hank Aaron. So it took years for that to happen. So for years, people thought that Babe Ruth was one of the greatest, baseball players in history. Here's, of course, Ty Cobb right here also, who played for the Detroit Tigers as well. Now, in football, that was another sport, of course, that was also big as well. They had a famous football player. I don't know if you ever heard of him. His name was Red Grange, was his name. And I'll get to him in a second. But they believe that football, which some people call it American gridiron, I guess, I think they call it in Canada or something like that. That's what they dub it. And they think it was influenced by rugby. They were kind of starting to play a little rugby in America, but like at schools like Harvard and Yale, Brown, and other schools up in the Northeast, they started basically playing football, American football. And so that took off as really as the big sport, I think, after pretty much, baseball. And Newt Rockne, you may have heard of him. He was considered the greatest football coach in the 1920s. He won more games than any coach for years. I think up into the modern era, you see he won 105 games, which I think he had like an 88% winning percentage, which is pretty good. That's almost as good as like Nick Saban. I don't know, I think, what is he? Close to the same amount or more. But yeah, the picture you're looking at right there is Red Grange. He was considered the greatest football player in the 1920s. In college, which he went to the University of Illinois, he rushed for over 3,300 yards in 20 games. That's pretty good. And he was also the first player, by the way, to go pro. Like from college, he went from like University of Illinois to Chicago Bears in the NFL at the time. And everybody called him the Galloping Ghost. They called him that because they couldn't catch him. He was so fast and they couldn't tackle him, basically. And so, yeah, he was considered the greatest football player at the time. And you can see they didn't have all the same kind of equipment they got now. They're just like brutal back then, that sport. You had blood all over you, and it was like you had a broken hand. You still went out there and played, and there's no injuries and timeouts and all that like they do now, I guess. So kind of football is kind of wimpy compared to back in the old days. Now I've also got this guy here. I don't know if you ever heard him. He's Jim Thorpe. Jim Thorpe, they say, was the greatest athlete in the 1920s. He was actually an Indian. He was a Sauk and Fox Indian, of course. Yeah, he was an Indian. Sauk and Fox Indian from, I think, Oklahoma, I believe it was. And he actually played multiple sports: baseball, football, basketball, track and field. He won a gold medal at the Olympics. He did the decathlon. He did the pentathlon. This guy did everything. He was a really good athlete. And so might have been one of the greatest athletes in American history, period, just because of all the sports he was good at, basically. So Jim Thorpe, of course. Also, another one, I don't know if you ever heard of this guy, too. He's, of course, a very famous boxer, of course, in the 1920s. Of course, that is Jack Dempsey, who, of course, was known as the Manasseh Mauler. He, of course, was really one of the first famous boxers that you have in American history. He was a celebrity in the 1920s. I think he was he made the most money out of any athlete, even more than Babe Ruth did, believe it or not. And he had a famous quote he once said. He said, "I can't sing and I can't dance, but I can lick any SOB in the house." And he was part Irish, but also part Cherokee. Yeah, I think they say his boxing matches were like some of the first broadcasted, like live on radio and things like that. And so that's part of why he gained so much fame. So everybody knew who he was. And that's, of course, another thing I want to talk about. Of course, it was big in, of course, the 1920s was the development of radio. Radio took off, of course. And the reason why radio became big in the 1920s was not just because of Marconi, what he had done with radio stuff, but this guy named Lee DeForest had invented this thing called the vacuum tube for like radios. And so that enabled people to create radios, basically for people to have a receiver. And so one of the first radio stations was found around 2021, which was KDKA, which is based in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So the first commercial one like that. So they are the first to broadcast, news and music, personalities or celebrities that would come on, basically. And you have to understand that back in those days, radio was like television today. They had all these TV shows like they had back then. They were like radio shows, that kind of deal. I remember my mom telling me stories about this growing up. She grew up like early in the Depression. Like, yeah, my mom's like goes back to the 1930s and 40s. She was born in 1937. She used to tell me all the stories about all these programs that would come on the radio, and they were real scary, some of them, because they had scary type shows they'd have and things like that. But you can see famous people would get on there like Babe Ruth, Will Rogers, and things like that, like you've got today. Radio and, of course, record play, the so-called phonograph, of course, popularized also jazz music. That's another thing that was real big, in the 1920s, is a new style of music that came out, which was influenced heavily a lot by African Americans, if you know about this. And jazz music started in Louisiana, I believe. I think there's kind of a debate between that and Chicago. I know both those. And jazz was called all kinds of names. They called it Dixieland music, ragtime music. They also called it jelly roll as well, which jelly roll and also jazz were slang terms for sex. And that's where the term jazz came from originally. But you can see it was a blend of different things. It was a blend of some European influences with also African influences as well. And of course, a lot of the young people liked it. You also have later what they call swing music, which becomes big in the 30s and 40s also as well, which kind of broke from it as well. And some of the famous jazz composers and musicians all lived, in around that time, the 20s and 30s, like, of course, Louis Armstrong, who, of course, is from Louisiana himself, named Satchmo. But these are all kinds of musicians that were big. Louis Armstrong, Ellie Fitzgerald, Bessie Smith, Duke Ellington. You may have heard of Cab Calloway, Jelly Roll Morton, Count Basie. Those are all great musicians that were big in the 20s. Armstrong might be one of the most famous, and I think Duke Ellington, Take the A Train. You may have heard that song before that he was big for. And even like Armstrong's big, even up to like the 1960s, I think he was putting out hits. That's how good he was, as a musician. Jazz music also spawned nightclubs. That's true about that. Like the so-called Cotton Club was the most notorious, of course, for selling illegal alcohol, of course, in the 20s, as you know, based in Harlem, New York. And it was supposed to be segregated, black and white, even in New York. A lot of times it wasn't. And so you have a lot of mingling of black, white people and things like that, which was common. Now, of course, the other thing that was big they talk about in the Roaring Twenties is you also had there's Duke Ellington, by the way, right there. So a great composer, you can see. But they also had the Harlem Renaissance. That was also big, too, where you had a lot of African-American artists that became real big in America. And what was it? Well, it was kind of this outpouring of all kinds of different culture, art. You can see music, literature, poetry that developed mostly in the Northeast, around Harlem, New York, where it was centered around. And these are some of the famous people that were kind of associated with it. You have Langston Hughes, of course, who really was probably the most famous. He was mostly a writer and, of course, mostly a poet. You had James Weldon Johnson, who was a writer, college professor. He's also a civil rights activist as well. Calvin Coolidge was a bunch of things. He was a novelist, poet, and playwright. W.B. Du Bois was a sociologist, writer, civil rights activist as well. But yeah, if you think about it, Langston Hughes was really the one that's probably the most famous that you really, hear about overall. I do have a little short bio I can kind of show you about more into his life.
Langston Hughes is considered a great author because he spoke to, for, and about Black people in America.
Poet, novelist, and playwright, Langston Hughes was the leading voice of the Harlem Renaissance.
America was changing during the time that Langston Hughes was so popular. Black consciousness was becoming more and more public, more prominent. I think that Langston Hughes was important because he was one of the early figures to show the dignity and the beauty of ordinary Black life.
He was one of the most visible of the younger Black poets, a new generation that described themselves as the new Negro. They covered new topics, took on new poetic forms, and sought a wider audience, and Langston Hughes was at the forefront of that.
James Mercer Langston Hughes was born in Joplin, Missouri on February 1st, 1902.
He wrote a lot about being lonely when he was young, and I think that was a tremendous part of the product of moving around so much.
After graduating high school, Hughes published his first and most famous poem, The Negro Speaks of Rivers.
It is the first poem that celebrates Africa and dignifies the image of Africa in American literature.
The Negro Speaks of Rivers was published in a popular black journal, and so he was really rather widely read from the beginning. His poetry and his prose actually had access to everyday people.
While studying at Columbia University, Hughes discovered the Harlem art scene, spending hours in jazz and blues clubs, weaving the rhythms of music into his work.
Jazz and blues were great influences on Langston Hughes. He sought to capture the energy and vitality of the music in his poetry.
He was very familiar with the Harlem nightlife. He knew the musicians, and later in his life he would even collaborate with some of the key figures at that time, such as Duke Ellington.
Hughes was a prolific writer and one of the first African-American authors who could support himself through his writing.
Langston Hughes wrote plays. He edited anthologies of poets of African descent across the diaspora. He wrote short stories. One of his most famous series of short stories centers around Jesse B. Simple. These are tales told by a resident of Harlem to an aspiring writer who's a stand-in for Langston Hughes.
He was one of the more widely published of the young poets of the period. He was also among the better connected. He really worked hard to promote the careers of other young writers in Harlem and also throughout the rest of his life. That's also one of his big legacies.
Langston Hughes died of cancer on May 22, 1967. His Harlem residence was given landmark status, a fitting tribute for a legendary writer.
His influence, his ambition as a creative writer, his success, his accessibility. He wrote for the average person. He was not writing for college classrooms. He was not writing for the elite. All of those things, I think, require that we recognize and acknowledge him as a great American literary voice of the 20th century.
A little short video there, of course, on Langston Hughes. Of course, there's his famous poet, The Negro Speaks of Rivers. So anyway, that was the Harlem Renaissance, of course, which kind of continued, into like the 1930s and all that. Of course, later publishing also other stuff as well. So let me also, of course, move on. I do want to also talk about, of course, there's Langston Hughes also right there, but I did want to talk about the Lost Generation also as well. That was big in the 1920s. What was the Lost Generation? It was a series of American writers that were mostly disillusioned about not just American life in general, but what happened with World War I, etc. Gertrude Stein is the one who kind of coined the term, I think a little later. And so it epitomized a lot of the popular novels that were big, in the 1920s. And a lot of them, if you know about a lot of these Lost Generation writers, left the country. They lived in Europe. Hemingway lived in Cuba, another place like they didn't want to live in the United States and all that. And of course, the most famous novelist, if you know that in the 1920s was F. Scott Fitzgerald. I think everybody's heard of, Fitzgerald just about, or had to read his book, which is called The Great Gatsby. The Great Gatsby is probably considered the greatest book or novel written in the 1920s, written in 1925. Like it says, it epitomized the whole Roaring Twenties culture, especially the flappers and the fancy dancers and I guess parties that they would have. And then, of course, all the bootlegging illegal liquor that was kind of going on in the 1920s. They made numerous movies out of it, also as well. So that's something that's kind of famous, about that. Then you have also Ernest Hemingway. I don't know if you've probably heard of him. I'm sure you've heard of Hemingway, hopefully. He, of course, is very, very famous as an American writer. You can see those books there, Farewell to Arms, The Sun Also Rises. Those were two books which were real big. And I know that first one on the right was his first big book I know that really made him a name, Farewell to Arms, which he got that from his influences in World War I when he volunteered as an ambulance driver in the Italian campaign. And The Sun Also Rises, that one's about primarily about bullfighting in Spain. I think he kind of popularized bullfighting as kind of a generic or sport. The other thing that's big, of course, in the 1920s was movies. Everybody wanted to go to a movie, see a movie. And back in those days, most movies didn't have sound. They were called silent films, where they had subtitles and they'd be talking, that kind of thing. And, so they had what they call the talkie came out. Oh, whoa, talkie, 1927. The first motion picture or movie with sound came out, which was called The Jazz Singer, which you can see here. It starred Al Jolson, and basically it became an instant hit. And so after that, nobody wanted to make silent movies anymore. So that's something that was, of course, big at the time. And who were the big actors back then? The big actors were Rudolph Valentino. I never heard of him, but he was this actor that everybody loved. The women did anyway. Women just swooned over him. He was kind of like the Johnny Depp or Brad Pitt, George Clooney kind of actor that women love and think is handsome. And he died young. I don't know if you know about this. When he died, they were like just women just lined up to kind of visit his coffin or something like that. Charlie Chaplin, you may have heard of him. He was the greatest comedian actor in 1920s and I think 30s. And he had this character called the Tramp character you may have heard of that was very famous. Also, the best actress was Mary Pickford. You may have heard of her. She was sometimes called the It Girl or the Girl with the Curls. And she was considered the first famous actress in the world and maybe the first female celebrity that you have that everybody knew, who she was and all that. So she was the biggest female actress, at the time. So I just kind of talk about, this popular culture that they've got in America. And also I did mention earlier, popular music, the flapper lifestyle, it did lead to new dances. I think I mentioned about this before, but the Charleston, the Foxtrot, those were very popular dances that were big in, of course, the 1920s and I guess in the 30s. And it actually spawned these dances that were called marathon dances. I don't even heard about this before. They'd have these dances where they would dance forever as competitions, with couples, which would go on for hours and hours and days and days. And there's a movie about that that's very interesting. It's called They Shoot Horses, Don't They? I don't know if you've ever seen that. It's got Jane Fonda in it, which is a really good movie. It's about these people that try to make money. I think it's during the Depression. After the Depression happens, it becomes a big thing. I know. I think in the 20s they did it too, also as well. So that's kind of some of the popular culture stuff that was, big in, of course, the 1920s. I've got a few minutes. I'm going to kind of go ahead and also talk about what happened, of course, later at the end of the 20s. Now, Herbert Hoover, he later would run for, he would run, of course, again he would run for president in 1928. I'll kind of get into him, but Coolidge could have run. That's the weird thing. There was no real amendment trying to prevent him from really running, but he decided not to run for re-election. And so what happened was Herbert Hoover, who was the Secretary of Commerce, came in. He basically, for California, became eventually the nominee for the Republicans in 1928. And the reason why Hoover became big was because the fact that at the end of World War I, he had helped bring relief to Europe, like food supplies and things like that. So it got him a good name. And he did also pretty good as a Secretary of Commerce under Calvin Coolidge administration. So people thought he'd be a great candidate, for president and all that. Of course, we find out later it proves to be wrong. If you know about that with the Great Depression later that happens. Of course, under him it starts. But Hoover ran against this guy named Al Smith, or Alfred Smith. Alfred Smith was an Irish Catholic. He was the governor of New York. Anyway, a lot of the Republicans, a lot of them were actually Protestant, didn't really want to support, this Catholic guy. And so they kind of do, view the Irish, Italians, Catholics as being kind of negative, that kind of thing. Most of the Republicans are Protestant. And so what happened was they came up with a bunch of slogans against him, which were kind of mean. They actually helped to actually get Hoover elected. These are it right here. One was that they said that a vote for Smith is a vote for the Pope, because he's Catholic. So he's probably more in support of the Catholic than, us. Also, Al Smith was a wet. He favored basically bringing back alcohol and ending, prohibition basically in the country. So they said he was for rum, Rummanism, and ruin. And so that actually hurt Smith, of course. I think Al Smith was one of the first Catholics to run for president, by the way, in the United States. There's only been two presidents been Catholic. That's, of course, Kennedy and, of course, Joe Biden, who just won. That's it. So it's very hard to be elected president when of course, you're Catholic and all that. Here's another picture showing you, by the way, here's Herbert Hoover, a picture of him right here if you want him right here. But Hoover, he would basically defeat Al Smith easily. It, of course, was a pretty much an election which was easily considered to be a landslide. Hoover actually got 444 electoral votes. That's a lot. And Al Smith only got 87. You can kind of see the difference between the two. And Al Smith, the reason why he lost was because of the fact that the Roaring Twenties was so prosperous. Hoover was kind of running on the coattails of Coolidge. Hoover's running on the coattails of Coolidge's, pretty much, economy, overall. And so people thought that it would just continue, after that. But what we're going to see later that's going to happen, with Hoover is that's all going to change. Hoover's going to come in Hoover's going to come in and, what's going to happen? The stock market crash is going to come, which happens in 1929. That, of course, is going to lead into the Great Depression. So things are not going to go well, for him. And by the way, Hoover is considered, to be one of the worst presidents in American history. I think he's number one in the top 10. So we'll talk about that later. I think that's pretty much the majority of the Roaring Twenties. I am going to, of course, next week I'll talk about the Great Depression. That's one of the things we'll be, of course, getting into how bad that was. So we'll get into that period overall. But before I go, don't forget, you do have, like I said, assignments that you've got out right now. First exam, of course, which, that basically needs to be done by the end of the week, by the weekend. I think it's been extended to Saturday, pretty much. Should be the March 27th. And then, like I said, I do have a new assignment up right now that I've got, of course, which is on the period of like Teddy Roosevelt, Taft, Wilson era. So that'll be due later next week overall. So that's it for today. I will see y'all, like I said, next week. I hope y'all have a good weekend coming up and all that. So y'all take care. If you have any questions, let me know. Bye.